And as always, model specification just means what kind of variables do you include in your model and how many lags in our autoregressive distributed lag model do we have. And here we have k additional predictors, which means that we have x1 and x2 and so on until xk. So we have k different variables, predictor variables, and we have q1 legs of the first predictor, okay, and we have q2 number of legs of the second predictor, and we have qk legs of the k variable, okay. So the model is really written as this, and it's quite flexible because you don't need the same lag for all the variables. So for example, for the yt variable, you can have 2 lags, and for the x1 variable, maybe this is the term spread, it can be 10 lags, and for the kth variable, you can have only 1 lag, for example. As always, to make our model work, we need some assumptions. And the first one is that the expected value of the residual, which means that the expected value of, or the expected effect of all the emitted variables on the y variable is on average 0. So, and it's 0 based on all lags of all the included variables in the model. And you saw in the previous slide that you have, for example, p lags of the y variable, but this assumption actually says that with the infinite history of all lags, this should hold, okay? And this means that the lags which are not included in the model does not affect the expectation of the residual. And this implies that the best forecast of the GDP growth rate is actually made by the best forecast of the y variable is made by the population equation, which is here. So the lags which are not in the model, and they do not affect the error term. Okay, and the second assumption is that the random variables, when we draw values from the variables, they have a stationary distribution. And this is equivalent to the IID assumption, the identically and independently distributed assumption that we saw from, for example, the cross-section regression. The idea of stationarity is actually quite important, so let's talk about that. Because a stationary variable, it means that the probability distribution does not change over time. And we can just, if we have like a plot, time here, and the stock price, at time t here, and you see that, well, often the stock price rises, and if you run an analysis on the stock price, then you would maybe use this data over here in order to, for example, calculate the mean of the stock price, and you could calculate the standard deviation of the stock price, and at a later stage, for example here, so this was the first sample and this is the second sample, then you see that the mean of the variable, which is the stock price, has increased, and the standard deviation has also increased. So this is a perfect example of a non-stationary process. Whereas if you look at the returns, the stock returns, let's say this is 0, and they often go something like this, right? And if you take a sample here, the early sample, then and you can calculate the average and the standard deviation, and then you can calculate the average and standard deviation of a different sample of a different time, then these should be fairly close to each other. So they should be quite similar. Of course, there might be like stock market crashes and stuff, but overall, the stock return is in general looked upon as a stationary process, because the mean and the standard deviation they do not change much. And in our autoregressive distributed lag model, then we have more variables. We don't only have one variable, we have k plus 1 variables, and the joint distribution, when we take samples from these, then the samples should be distributed equally from period to period. So time should not affect the expected mean or variance of these joint distribution draws. We are going to talk a lot about stationarity, and that's because it's incredibly important. Because as we have seen from beforehand, if our assumptions hold, then we can use statistics to say something about our model. We have some confidence in our model. But if we have non-stationary variables in our model, then if we examine the results of running the OLS regression model on our model specification, then our results might not be reliable. And some of the problems we can encounter could be biased forecasts, or the model can be inefficient, or which means that the standard errors are way off, they are too wide, and for example, statistical inferences might be misleading. If we use, for example, an assumption of the normal distribution and use the critical value of 1.96. And this we will talk more about later. We are going to look at hypothesis tests and confidence intervals and forecasts regarding stationarity. A kind of second note on the distribution of the or the joint distribution of the variables is that they might be somewhat correlated if the time periods are close to each other, but if you have time periods further away from each other, then the relationship should not be correlated. So if the time span between our draws get large, then these draws should be more and more uncorrelated. And this means that they are independent, and they are then identically but independently distributed. And this assumption is called weak dependence because it does not hold strictly, but the relationship between these draws, it tapers off as long as the time span between them becomes larger. And as you have from beforehand, large outliers should be unlikely, and this means that all the variables, all the predictor variables, the x variables, and our y variable, they have finite fourth moments. And there should be no perfect multicollinearity between these variables. So the big question is, why do we care about these assumptions? Well, because if they hold, then we can actually perform our analysis or our hypothesis test. So we can calculate the f-stat and the t-stat and say something about the coefficients, and we can say something about the coefficients with some sort of probability.